This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
This evening. Well, now that the debaters have been introduced, I'd like to go over the format. It was agreed by a coin toss earlier this evening that Dr. Hansen will speak first. You can see that's what he was thinking a minute ago. He will speak for 25 minutes. Then Ms. Huffington will speak for 25 minutes. Next, Dr. Hansen and Ms. Huffington will each have 15 minutes to make a rebuttal in that order. Then there will be a half-hour question and answer period, and it will begin with the speakers having the opportunity to put a question to each other. The question should take no more than a minute to ask, a couple of minutes to answer. That will leave about 25 minutes for you, the audience, to participate. As a courtesy to the speakers, my assistant, Melissa Ware, who's sitting front center there, will hold up a sign indicating when there are 2 minutes left to speak, then 1 minute left to speak, and when she holds up the red sign and I ring the bell, it means that the speaker's time is up. Now that the format has been explained, I invite Dr. Hansen to make the opening argument. You have 25 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here at the invitation of the Ford Center and Grand Valley. And it is true that Ms. Huffington and I share one overriding commonality, and that's love of Greece. It formed my early years, and I've devoted my life to it, so it's something that we do share. But we don't share this view about empire. When I think of empire, I think of Athens, the Athenian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Kaiser's Prussian Empire, the German Nazi Empire, we could use that term, the Soviet Empire. The word comes from the Latin imperium, to use power, to coerce, or to exact tribute, or to exercise influence where others don't want you to do. We think of the mercantile system and imperial system. None of those terms, as we know it, fit at all the United States. Not at all. Think for a minute. Every empire has had an imperial culture, an art, music, and literature. Virgil wrote his Aeneid glorifying the new Rome. Kipling's poems about the white man's burden of the Victorian Empire. Think of our writers. Oliver Stone, what did he say after 9/11? What did Norman Mailer say? What did Philip Roth say? What did Susan Sontag say? What did Alice Walker? It was either something nihilistic or quite critical of the United States at its greatest moment of peril since World War II. We don't have an imperial culture, far from it. When we have our proconsul $300 billion surplus with us, South Korea will not defend themselves without us. They have a trade surplus. Japan has an archaic banking system. They have a trade surplus. So after creating this system, we find out that we not only can't enforce it or master it, we're often at a great disadvantage. Politically, well, what empires do is they take people's territory, and then they dictate the conditions under which they have to be imperial subjects. The United States has not taken anybody's land since 1898 in the Philippines. And what's even stranger is at just the time we were being called imperial, we're getting out of everywhere. Took every troop out of Saudi Arabia. We're trying to take 40,000 troops out of Germany. That was very funny because while Mr. Schroeder was calling us an imperial power, his own mayors from German cities were in the Pentagon begging us to stay. I was always amused by that sign when we left the Philippines. There was a big sign by the crowd that says, "Americans go home, dash, and take me with you." So there has never been an idea that we were going to go take somebody's land. A lot of Americans died in Okinawa, and what did we do? We gave it back to the Japanese, willingly. We gave, as someone said, we took the Panama Canal fair and square by stealing it, and now we've given it back. That's not a trait of an imperial power. We fund 25% of the UN. And yet if you look at the UN declarations or the resolutions, 48% of them that have been proposed have been against our ally Israel, and we are always condemned. And yet the United Nations is on American shores, and we pay the largest contribution for its budget. Again, politically, economically, culturally, there's nothing imperial in our veins. Which brings me to the one thing that all empires do. They have a militarily sophisticated system that's in service to imperial aggrandizement. But our wonderful military just doesn't fit that definition. If you wanted to look at some of the sharpest critics of the Iraqi war, who were they? Wesley Clark and General Zinni, generals of all people. If you look at the percentage of the budget that the United States devotes for military preparedness, it doesn't seem like any empire in history. The Athenians probably spent 25% of what we know of their gross domestic product. The Romans even more. The Germans and the Russians, 25-30%. Britain may have spent a lot smaller amount, but it was only because they really didn't have a navy for most of their an army for most of their imperial tenure. The United States only recently has got up to 4% of the GDP is spent on defense-related matters. 1950, 70% of all non-discretionary funds were spent on the military and 30% were spent on domestic. People weren't talking that we were an empire. Then now they are, and we spend exactly the opposite ratio. 30% of non-discretionary federal dollars on defense, 70% on entitlements and domestic spending. Look at what the U.S. military has done lately. It's not just that they've closed bases in places like Saudi Arabia and Germany, and they're trying to reduce their role in Korea. They've done very strange things. They went into Grenada and took out a totalitarian communist and left a democracy. Imperial, maybe, but that's not what empires usually do. They went and took out Noriega, they left a democracy. They went in and bombed a Christian country in the heart of Europe, Mr. Milosevic, and tried to start a democracy. They took out a fascistic, theocratic country in the Taliban, and they tried to start a democracy. Whatever your opinions are about Iraq, when we went in, everybody said no blood for oil, and the price of oil was about $38. It's $70 now. So we have this tendency of an empire often removing fascistic dictators after the Cold War and then creating democracies which are not always friendly to us. And the locus classicus, of course, is the '91 Gulf War. Here we were sitting on the top of a quarter of the world's oil reserves. We didn't even remove Saddam, and we turned over the 19th province of Iraq, the former Kuwait, to the Kuwaitis. And what did the first thing the Kuwaitis did? Over our objections, they ethnically cleansed every Palestinian. That's an important thing to remember, because right after 9/11, the Kuwaitis polled the highest anti-American sentiment of any country in the Middle East, and when they were asked why, it was the U.S. treatment of the Palestinians. This is a country that was saved by us and ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, and it's a touchstone to understand why people allege that we're an empire. It's not empirical, but as we'll see, it fulfills a deep psychological need in a lot of people. But it's not just enough to say that we don't do bad things and we're not an empire. We do a lot of good as the world's most influential power. As we speak, we're trying to have six-party talks in Korea. China's Klein has gone nuclear. If we were to pull in our horns and leave, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Japan would go nuclear to protect its interest. It would build 4,000 nukes within a year, and they would work. They would work like Toyotas and Hondas, not North Koreans. Taiwan would go nuclear. South Korea would go nuclear. And you would have a real arms race. If we were to withdraw from the Middle East, Iran will go nuclear. And perhaps Saudi Arabia would go nuclear in response. And perhaps Syria would go nuclear. If we decided that we would withdraw from Europe, remember, had a utopian agenda that said it didn't need any defense anymore. And then they ended up with Milosevic. And who did they call? Us. And what was the result? Mr. Milosevic was gone in 7 weeks after he killed 250,000 people under the noses of the Europeans. And what was their reaction? We bombed. We're an empire. We were wrong to save them from Milosevic. The question then is, what are we if we're not an empire? Well, we are the most influential, military, powerful, democratic state in the history of civilization. Now, why did that happen? It didn't happen because we had a bunch of imperial planners in the rooms of the Pentagon. It happened for two reasons. The first, our founding fathers created in 6 or 7 pages what the Europeans cannot do in 1,000. They created this unique balance of power that protects property, guarantees individual rights, creates a mechanism for evolutionary liberal progress. It's turned into the most egalitarian, multiracial society in the history of civilization, and because of that, it exercises influence in culture, politics, economics, more than all of the rest of the planet put together. We take more immigrants into the United States than more countries put together. The second reason that we are so powerful is an artifact of the Cold War. Remember that we were isolationists in the 19th century. And what happened? We went into the 20th century, we went to World War I, and we got involved late, but in a fashion that was decisive, and we saved Western liberal democracy from Prussian totalitarianism. And what happened after that? We withdrew, and we had another European war in 20 years. The German army was not defeated. It gave up in foreign territory. It went right back and said, we never lost. So we were back in Europe, and this time we did not leave. But we stayed on to protect Europe from the new threat of the Soviet system that meant an end to all we had accomplished in the 20th century. And so after the Soviet system collapsed, we were faced with this choice. You want to be isolationists and go back home as you did after World War I and leave Nazism to be the next peril? Or do you want to stay engaged after you did World War II and defeat communism? So unlike the Europeans and others, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we did not disarm. We cut back on our defenses during the Clinton era quite substantially, down to about 3.5% of GDP, but we stayed on. And in a bipolar world, one side quit and collapsed. And that is not going to be written in stone. As we speak, again, the Chinese, who are adapting our system, finally, and given up on the Mao communist revolution of open markets, a capitalist system, a method of investment, private property, are finding the same success that we have. And given the rules of the system we created, they will be as powerful because they have 1 billion people, and people in 20 years will be talking about the Chinese empire. But believe me, unless they become democratic, they will not treat people in the Middle East when they want oil the way that we do. Watch out for that, because it's going to be probably a real empire unless it becomes democratic. Let me just recap a bit. Nothing in our political, economic, cultural, or military behavior or protocols is anything resembling empires of the past. We do far more good than people give us credit for, which leaves us with a question. Why do people at this time and this age say that we are imperial? And if you scan almost all of the titles of books, magazine articles, op-eds that allege we are imperial, they have one common denominator. They're almost all critical of the United States. Nobody says we like the United States because they're imperial. So the ideas are synonymous. But let's be very careful and focus on who is calling the United States imperial. It's not 1 billion Indians in India. They are more than happy that the United States, at great risk to the economy, to people like you in the audience, allowed outsourcing, and you allowed free trade, and you created an entire new middle class in India, and they just polled 76% of those in India, 1 billion people, a fifth to the sixth of the planet, are pro-American. They're not the Japanese. The Japanese really do know the difference between a country with imperial aspirations like China and us, and they are desperate to have good relations with the United States. They're not the Eastern Europeans. They don't think we're imperial. They know what an empire was and who saved them from that. They're not even all of the Europeans. If you look what's going on in Scandinavia and Holland and Denmark, they know what empires in the past have done to them when they go across the Rhine. So let's be honest. Who are the people in the world today that are alleging that the United States is an empire contrary to all the empirical evidence that we discussed? They're basically just three groups. The first is the Middle East. Aside from the fact that the Middle East shows no gratitude. After all, it was the United States that bombed a Christian country to save Muslims over the objections of almost everybody in the world. For all the rhetoric of bin Laden, he did nothing to save his own Muslim brothers in Bosnia. We got nothing but criticism from the Middle East. We saved Kuwait, a Muslim country, from Saddam Hussein. We were the only country in the 80s and the 90s to criticize the Russians over their treatment about Muslims. We tried to save the Muslims in Somalia from starvation. Why is there no ingratitude? It's very simple. Because of the 22 countries in the Middle East, none until recently were democratic. Only Iraq has that potential. Only Iraq has that potential. And with the globalization movement, which they associate rightly with American popular culture, for the first time, people in the Middle East, when they turned on an internet on their computer, when they looked at a DVD, when they had a satellite dish, they knew that life was worse in Damascus than Paris. They knew life was worse in Cairo, much worse in Cairo than it was in Seoul. They knew life was much worse in Baghdad and Tokyo. And they had no method of expressing that anger on the Arab street. In a censored, dictatorial, and autocratic Middle East, they had no way to address those problems. The leaders did not want to take the tough measures that other people who had done in South America and Asia to find success. Don't discuss polygamy. Don't discuss gender apartheid. Don't discuss religious intolerance. Instead, make a devil's bargain with right-wing, fascistic Islamic terrorists to blame two people, the Jews and the United States, for all of the self-induced misery, and they are a powerful anti-American bloc. And you hear most of the United States being a pernicious empire emanating from the Middle East. There's one other group, and that is Western Europe, and specifically Germany and France. These really were imperial cultures. They really were. If you ask the Danish or the Dutch or the Poles, what was Germany like in World War I, or what was Germany like in World War II, or what was France like under Napoleon? These were grand imperial cultures that invaded and took what they wanted. And now they don't do that. In fact, they're very angry that their influence in the world has been curtailed by whom? A multiracial, radically democratic, radically anti-aristocratic culture that brings everybody in the world here and succeeds by being antithetical, as all of our grandparents and great-grandparents knew when they came here, antithetical to Europe. They are angry. And they're angry now in a way that they were not in the 70s because of what? There's no longer 300 Soviet divisions on their border. So now they can say whatever they want without a defense because the United States won that war for them. And for the foreseeable future, and I emphasize foreseeable, because in their utopian postmodern world, a man like Milosevic was not supposed to come, just like the Iranians were not supposed to have nuclear weapons 3 hours from Berlin. But when that happens, they pull in their horns for a second and call the United States. And there's one last thing why they're very angry and allege that we are imperial, because their system, their alternate strain of Western civilization, high taxes, statism, utopianism, pacifism, has led in record levels of unemployment, almost no growth, unassimilated minorities, and so that Europe is worse off at a time of peace than the United States is at a time of war. And that makes them angry, just like a teenager is mad at its parents because it wants to be independent, and yes, it wants to be dependent at the same time. There's one other group. Never in history has civilization seen a more affluent, leisured, and comfortable class than millions in Western Europe, the United States. I'm not talking about the people who get up 8 to 5 and work at a plant in Michigan or where I live, who pick grapes every day. They don't talk about empire. But there's a large number of highly sophisticated, highly intellectual, well-informed people who understand that they are quite well off. And they do not believe they're quite well off for the reasons we discussed, because of this unique system that not just takes the world's resources, but gives the world things like chemotherapy and AIDS drugs and uses all of its wealth in a way that benefits most of mankind. They're angry because they believe that somehow what they have was not created, but taken from somebody. But this is where it gets very interesting, because they're angry in a boutique way. They don't want to go down and live in Fresno. They don't want to put their kids in the public schools. They don't want to do that sort of thing that might take away the life of a tenured professor or a life of a Hollywood movie star. So what do in the abstract? In the abstract, they criticize the United States because it brings, let's be honest, enormous psychological relief for them at very little cost. Let me just finish by saying that any time somebody starts in on the United States as a pernicious empire, just remember it usually tells you almost nothing about America and almost everything about themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now invite Ms. Huffington to make her opening argument. You have 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Victor. This was a really great presentation, and the most amazing thing is that he could have actually done it in Greek. I tested his Greek at dinner earlier, and he does speak it with a better accent than I speak English. In fact, one of the most dangerous things is a brilliant mind like Victor Hansen mind in the grip of a bad, wrong idea. And that's what we had here. That was a demonstration of what we had here tonight. In fact, what is so interesting is that I was doing some research on your previous sayings and writings, and I came across an amazing interview that you gave on NPR before September 11. This is very significant because September 11 was that moment when a lot of what we're going to discuss tonight about empire or republic became focused in a different way. So before September 11, there was Victor Davis Hansen himself answering the following question. I'd love to hear you explain that later. Neil Conan on NPR asked him, the world's empire and hegemony, of course, are Latin and Greek words. Does the US today bear any relationship to the definitions of empire that you are familiar with from the classics? And your reply was, they do. They refer to the ability to exercise power beyond one's borders. So, no matter what you said here today about McDonald's and our popular culture and the fact that we don't have imperial literature, we don't have a Kipling, all we have is Donald Rumsfeld saying stuff happens. That's not my fault, the fact that we don't have any great literature. Instead, we have this slightly postmodernist defense secretary telling us that he can't know anything because everything is so complex. The point remains that you yourself, before September 11, called America an empire, and you went further than that. You actually said that another characteristic of an empire is what America has, which is, I see a little bit of that, meaning what Rome had, in ourselves, that we've created a world military culture of people who are not necessarily from the same class or share the same values as the elites who order them and plan their lives for them. Don't we see that in Iraq at the moment? We have one class of people who fight the war in Iraq. 40% of them are actually from the National Guard. That's not what they actually bargained for. They were much more likely to be expecting to be in New Orleans, helping people there, than to be in Iraq, fighting the war there. But that's another example of an empire, that you have people making decisions here who don't have skin in the game. They don't have their children there, they don't have their grandchildren there, they certainly don't have themselves there. They just decide who is going to die in a faraway country that does not affect our own immediate security. And that is really the heart of what I want to argue here tonight. After all the explanations about why we are in Iraq have failed, we are basically left with the explanation that many people on your side of the fence don't want to hear, which is the fact that before September 11, there was that project for a new American century, where a lot of the neocons found a home, which actually had wanted to bring about what has come about, and which they defined as overthrowing Saddam Hussein, installing a friendly government in Baghdad, setting up a permanent political and military presence in Iraq, and dominating the behavior of the region, including securing oil supplies, building permanent bases. We are building 12 to 14 permanent military bases there. And all that has really absolutely nothing to do with the security of this country. This is a tragic imperial adventure that had been planned before September 11, and September 11 was used as a way to unfortunately convince the American public at the beginning that we had a justification and a reason that had to do with our own security to go in. And let me just take off my jacket and just start by looking at all the various explanations that have led us into Iraq. Because, ultimately, what we're discussing tonight in terms of empire has to do with Iraq. It doesn't have to do with North Korea. It doesn't have to do with outsourcing. It doesn't have to do with globalization. It has to do with the most tragic decision of an American government, which is to invade a country that did not present a threat to our own security. And just look at the different explanations that we've had for invading Iraq. First of all, there was the illusion that somehow Saddam Hussein was behind September 11. That was repeated so many times that during the last election, a poll was taken that showed that over 40% of Americans believed what is in fact an absolute and total lie. Then, of course, we had the unequivocal existence, the way it was presented to the American public, of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, or the ability to create nuclear weapons. We had Condoleezza Rice talking about mushroom clouds. We had Colin Powell talking about aluminum tubes. We had all that rhetoric, which was used, as Paul Wolfowitz admitted at one point, because it was seen as the easiest way to convince the American public that this was a war that was justified because of our own security. Because the American people are fundamentally a people who want to mind their own business. And that goes back to the founding of this country. We are not an imperial nation in our DNA. It's a certain class, it's a certain neocon ideological class that has actually brought about the reality we're now facing. And what was fascinating about that is that at dinner tonight, I had the great pleasure to be sitting next to Annette Kirk, who was married to Russell Kirk, who wrote The Conservative Mind, and is one of the great, of course, philosophers of the conservative movement. And we talked about that, and there is no question that Russell Kirk, as so many other conservatives, would have been completely against the war in Iraq. The essence of what Russell Kirk believed and wrote about was prudence. You do things in a prudent way as a government. And there is nothing more imprudent than pursuing an unnecessary war, because an unnecessary war is the height of immorality. And so if we go down the list of explanations why we're there, democratizing the region is the default position. It's about explanation number 4. It was never mentioned when we invaded Iraq at the beginning. Remember, at the time, we were expected to be met as liberators. Do you remember all that? It was going to be a cakewalk. It was going to be so easy. And look what we're facing there right now. Incredible loss of American life, and I don't mean just the loss in terms of deaths, but the young men and women who come home mutilated, unable to really lead a normal life. We have over $300 billion already spent, and most important of all, we are less secure as a result of having invaded Iraq. And that is the ultimate crime of an empire, because it does not have anything to do with our own self-interest, which primarily, the first and foremost, has to do with our safety and security. Remember when the president had told us that we're going to capture Osama bin Laden, dead or alive? What happened to him? Isn't this a tremendous failure of this administration, that the man who masterminded September 11 is still at large? That in fact, when we look at the resources that we have spent in Iraq compared to the resources that we are spending to secure our homeland and to pursue the war on terror, which had never anything to do with Saddam Hussein. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a despicable despot who absolutely deserved to be removed from office. But I can give you a long list of despicable despots who deserve to be removed from office, and that's not the business of the United States. And let me just compare our imperial adventure to the imperial adventure of Athens during the Sicilian expedition. Victor has a book coming out about the Peloponnesian War, so I'm sure you're very familiar with that. The Sicilian expedition, which took place from 1415 to 1413 BC, was part of this other clash of civilizations between Athens and Sparta. And if you go back and read Thucydides describing the Sicilian expedition, it is so chillingly reminiscent of what is happening right now, right down to Alcibiades, who could have been George Bush or Don Rumsfeld, predicting that this was going to be a cakewalk, that it was going to show our other enemies how strong we are. Do you think America's enemies are quaking at the moment? When you look at the disaster we are facing in Iraq, the disaster we were not able to deal with in New Orleans, don't you think we are appearing more vulnerable and weaker than we definitely appeared before we invaded Iraq? Unquestionably so. And in the same way that the Sicilian expedition ultimately led to the end of the Athenian Empire, I fear that unless some more rational brains prevail, that's what's going to happen because of Iraq. And I'm not making that point in any partisan way at all. In fact, I don't think that our debate tonight about empire, about our presence in Iraq, has anything to do with left and right. Absolutely nothing at all. The most interesting voices being raised at the moment against the war, against our imperial adventure in Iraq, are conservative voices. It's Senator Chuck Hagel who said unequivocally, we are less safe because we're in Iraq. It is the conservative congressman Walter Jones, who was a passionate supporter of the war in Iraq. In fact, he was the congressman who renamed French fries freedom fries. Do you remember that? And now he's passionately in favor of getting out of Iraq. In fact, he has co-authored a resolution together with Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey about a specific exit strategy out of Iraq. And I can give you a long list of Democratic leaders who are demonstrating the very timidity, spinelessness, and cowardice that has turned the Democratic Party deservedly into a minority party. And let me give you one example, none other than Hillary Clinton herself, who was on CNN being interviewed by Judy Woodruff recently, and Judy Woodruff, before Judy Woodruff stopped being on CNN that recently, asked her, so what is your exit strategy in Iraq? And she replied, I'm not comfortable with an exit strategy. That's how terrified Democrats are to speak the truth to the American public. They're triangulating, they're calculating, they're part of this confusion of an empire. And that's why I personally have an unequivocal litmus test when it comes to 2008. I'd like to have a Democratic nominee who can speak a clear, unambiguous sentence on Iraq. And my point to Senator Clinton is, if you're not comfortable with an exit strategy, can you please step out of the way and point us to somebody who is comfortable with an exit strategy? Because young men and women are dying there, and they are dying because our leaders are not comfortable with an exit strategy. And if you want more evidence that we are an empire when it comes to Iraq, just listen to that poor president of Iraq, President Talabani, who the day before yesterday had the temerity to give an interview to the Washington Post in which he said that American troops should start withdrawing and maybe 40 to 50,000 of them would be out of Iraq by the end of the year. Well, he must have got quite a spanking by the imperial powers at the White House, because yesterday at the press conference with the president, he was speaking from very different talking points. He was saying that, no, we cannot set a date for the withdrawal of troops because that will embolden our enemies. You know, the same junk we've been hearing from the administration endlessly repeated. The bottom line is, as he said, that we are not going to do anything without the complete agreement of the United States. That's not a free democracy speaking. That's not the president of a free democracy speaking, and we know it, and they know it. And as for this constitution, which now is going to go to the public to be voted on, a constitution that basically excludes the Sunnis. That's the bottom line of this constitution. A constitution that makes Ahmed Shalabi happy, but is going to further divide this nation of Iraq. Is this really the kind of constitution that a free, democratic Iraq could be based on? Again, I'm going to quote Russell Kirk, because he was terribly skeptical of any attempt to democratize countries that do not have our history and do not share our principles. We cannot impose democracies through our military. That is really a fundamental error, which we're seeing the results of in Iraq right now. So let us just go back to the founding of this country. Because if you just go back to Washington's farewell address, if you go back to John Quincy Adams, and I would just like to quote just one thing from Adams, you see very clearly that we were never meant to be about imperial adventures and foreign entanglements. As he famously admonished the American people, America goes not abroad, Adams wrote, in search of monsters to destroy. And Saddam Hussein was clearly a monster worth destroying. But that was not what America was about or is about. America, he wrote, is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. And if only Democrats realized, democratic leaders I mean, that this would be an amazing message to bring red and blue states together. Red states would completely respond to this message. Because this is not, they know perfectly well, people who are working from early in the morning to late at night to put bread on the table. Our presence in Iraq is in no way going to make their family safer or their lives easier as they're facing the constant struggles they're facing every day. So that's why, to paraphrase Toynbee, any autopsy of history will show us that empires in the end commit suicide. And the decision to invade Iraq was a suicidal decision. The American people are waking up. The American people are waking up ahead of their leaders. Over 60% of Americans right now are against the war in Iraq, way ahead of our leaders, of both parties. Because although the Democrats have Senator Russ Feingold, who has offered an exit strategy, and although the Republicans have Senator Hagel and Congressman Walter Jones and Congressman Ron Paul, the leadership of both parties is still in a state of absolute delusion about Iraq. You have the president who continues to claim that we must stay the course. What does that mean? Why is staying the course a sane public policy when the result is going over a cliff? And you have the Democratic leaders who are so terrified of being considered soft on the war on terror that they're incapable of seeing what an incredible opportunity this is for the Democrats to redefine national security in terms of protecting the homeland and making this country safe and secure. This is not an anti-war movement that talks about making love, not war. This is not an anti-war movement that should be focusing on peace versus war. This is an anti-war movement that should be focusing on security here at home, as opposed to an imperial adventure that is making this country less secure, that has turned Iraq, as the CIA's intelligence unit has actually claimed, with facts to prove it, into a breeding ground for professional Islamic terrorists, and has united the Muslim world against America in a way that Osama bin Laden could only have dreamed of. And also, as we saw in New Orleans so clearly, this country is not ready for a natural disaster or a terrorist attack at the moment. Our public health infrastructure is in shambles. Our ability to respond at the federal level, the state level, and the local level is in shambles. Cronyism abounds. You know, cronyism is another incredible manifestation of empire. Who did we have at the head of FEMA? But an Arabian horse expert who was a friend of the president's. And what is going on in Iraq at the moment with the incredibly corrupt and fraudulent way of the use of public resources, as it happens at the end of empires. We can't even get a Truman-style committee going, even though there is bipartisan support in the House. To have a committee there, whether you're for this war or against the war, you should be in favor of a committee to look at how the money is spent. There's $9 billion that cannot even be accounted for. There are 70 criminal investigations pending into how taxpayer money is being spent. Halliburton is being found guilty again and again, but keeps being given more contracts to reconstruct Iraq. And you see what a great job they're doing reconstructing Iraq. They're now going to reconstruct New Orleans. This is another blatant manifestation of cronyism, of lack of accountability. Accountability being at the very heart of a functioning republic. After 2 weeks of the president taking no responsibility for New Orleans, we see him finally yesterday admitting responsibility like a little boy who had to swallow down his medicine because clearly his pollsters told him, you know, you got to say something. You know, the American public thinks you are responsible. You got to own up to it. Karl Rove gave different directions, cut, go again, use different talking points, move from cluelessness to taking responsibility. Saying that you love New Orleans and you remember partying there was not the right talking point in the middle of a disaster. And your mother saying that it must be really nice for these underprivileged people to be actually have something better in the Texas-Houston Superdome was not a very smart move. So moving from cluelessness to taking some responsibility is the way they are trying to deal with what, in fact, we have seen, both in the way we are proceeding in Iraq and the way this administration handled the disaster in New Orleans as the essence of an empire, the combination of hubris, overweening arrogance, for those whose Greek is a little rusty, and incompetence. Hubris and incompetence at the very heart of our imperial adventure in Iraq. And so we may not have Kipling, Victor, and we may not have great imperial literature, but we do have an enormous amount of spin. And spinning is the equivalent of the great imperial poems that you wish we had, but we don't have. Instead, we have the vice president telling us that we're in the last throes of the insurgency, just as the insurgency is getting stronger and stronger. We have the Secretary of Defense sounding increasingly postmodernist in his press conferences. It's this combination of telling us that everything is so complex. There are Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds, and how can you really know what's going on, right? I mean, how can we know what we don't know, right? The only thing the Secretary of Defense seems to really, really unambiguously know is that we are winning. So it's time for the American public, starting with those of us here in this room, whether we are Republicans or Democrats, to tell the truth, because there is nothing more important. There is no greater antidote for imperial adventures than truth-telling. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hansen, you have 15 minutes for a rebuttal.
Thank you very much. I think we already had the rebuttal instead of the presentation, but I'll rebut the rebuttal prematurely. Thought we were going to talk about empire, but I'm more than happy to talk about Iraq. I was struck by your quotation of the NPR interview because it proved just what I said today, that the only characteristic that is any remotely connected with empires, we influence people abroad. And I gave you a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with our status as an imperial power, but as one is very powerful. That's what the point of that interview was about. Almost everything Ariana said, unfortunately, was inaccurate. 70% how would you know whether the losses are inordinate in Iraq? And that's to look at the 2,000 people who have died. Do they represent a cross-section of that volunteer army? The United States military people who have died in Iraq, 6% are African American, 10% of the population are African American. Of the people who died in Iraq, 9% are Latino, 11% of the American public is Latino. 29% of the American people graduated from a high school in a poverty zone, but the same ratio, 30% died from a poverty zone in Iraq. There was one group, though, that was inordinately lost their lives in Iraq, and those were middle-class white male officers, 70% of all the dead, mostly from 28% from the Marine Corps. And although you're right about the National Guard, roughly 34% of the people there were National Guard, only 16% have lost their lives. So there must have been a conspiracy in Washington to take white males with high school diplomas from the middle class and have them die off in Iraq. I don't like the September 23rd, 1998 letter that you mentioned either. I think it was a mistake that people wrote a letter to President Clinton asking before 9/11. I would have never signed that letter. I didn't. But look who did, and look who did not. Dick Cheney didn't sign it. George Bush didn't sign it. Condoleezza Rice didn't sign it. None of them did. And why didn't they? Because they ran as realists that did not want to get involved. That's what George Bush said in the election. But one thing changed their mind, and that was 9/11. You take away 9/11, we would not be in Iraq today. Absolutely. And was Iraq about WMD? The U.S. Senate on October 11th of 2002 voted to authorize a war. And they voted for 23 different resolutions. Only one was WMD. They covered everything from trying to assassinate the former president of the United States, to genocide, to violations of the 1991 Accords, to violations of United Nations, to the destruction of the environment. They were all voted by a majority of 76 senators. And if you could read the speeches of John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, they were quite stirring. Was 9/11 having anything remotely to do? Directly, no, but there was no accident that the person who organized the first World Trade explosion in 1993 went right to Iraq, and he was in Baghdad when we invaded. Kurdistan, which had a viable system only because of our no-fly zones, had al-Qaeda in it on 9/11, and they were there with Saddam Hussein's approval. A Iraqi intelligence officer, Mr. Shakur, met with the people who tried to blow up 11 airliners before 9/11. Mr. Zakawi, the architect of the resistance today, where was the first place he went to when he was wounded? Iraq. And there was no accident that Abu Abbas, Abu Nadal, all of the bin Ladens of the 1970s were in Baghdad when we arrived. The only country in the entire world that was shooting at military officers, military personnel of the United States, was in Iraq on 9/11. We had been, for 12 years, we had been flying and occupying in an act of war 2/3 of the Iraqi airspace. And remember, General Zinni, a big critic of the war, and Bill Clinton as well, bragged in 1998 that they had attacked Iraq and killed 5,000 Iraqis. And why? Because they were worried about WMD. WMD was probably wrong, but I don't think the United States military was in on the conspiracy to force their own soldiers to wear heavy chemical gear so they wouldn't be attacked, or that Mr. Mubarak would have warned General Myers about WMD would be used as a reason not to go in there. Nobody thinks that the 2,000 dead is a tragedy any more than myself, but I can't think of any war after 4 years that we've lost 2/3 the amount of dead than we lost on the first minute of this war, when 3,000 were lost. Are we safer? Well, we haven't had, unlike Europe, Spain, London, Middle East, we have not had another 9/11. And 2/3 of the al-Qaeda leadership are scattered. They're no longer operating. Don't take my word for it, Mr. Musharraf said they have symbolic significance. That was his word. But they were not a real terrorist cadre anymore. And whether you agree with Iraq or not, there have been great changes in the Middle East. I cannot think that Mr. Gaddafi would have given up his nuclear commerce had it not been for the fate of Saddam Hussein. I do not think Mr. Khan in Pakistan would suddenly, out of the blue, decide that he would no longer traffic in nuclear machinery. I don't think the Syrians would have got out of Lebanon and given Lebanon a real chance for democracy had they not seen what happened to Saddam Hussein. I don't think that we would have an election in Cairo. It may have been rigged, but an Arab columnist said there's no going back now in Egypt because we have, I think quite rightly, given up the old realpolitik that said just pump oil and keep out communists and we'll give you a blank check because we have 7,000 nuclear weapons pointed at us from the Soviet Union and we can't afford to be idealistic. That went out the window by all people. A realist president who, far from being a neocon imperialist, did not want to do that, but did it after 9/11 because he saw for the first time that realism was idealism, that the way to break that unholy alliance between dictators and terrorists in the Middle East was to offer a third alternative, and that's why he did it. Saddam Hussein, was he a terrorist like everybody else? Was he an autocrat like everybody else? Wasn't the world full of them? Ariana says, yes, it is, but he was a little bit unique. He was sitting on 1/5 of the world's oil reserves with a proven record of translating those petrodollars into weapons of mass destruction and deadly weapons. He had attacked 4 of his neighbors. He was the only country we were de facto at war with, if you think occupying 2/3 of somebody's airspace is at war. Ariana mentioned the Sicilian expedition, that great folly of the Athenians in 415. She suggested that it might have resonance to understand Iraq, but it's very careful to use that analogy because it'll bite you. Right in the middle of a war, democratic Athens attacked democratic Sicily that was larger than it was. It would be as right in the middle of the Afghan war we decided to attack India, which we didn't. And then the most ironic thing about that comparison is the historian who himself saw it, Thucydides. I don't agree with his estimation, but we should repeat what he said. He said, for all the mistaken calculations of Sicily, it would have worked had people not at home squabbled and fought among each other. That was his words, not mine. We do have an exit strategy. Very good exit strategy. It's simply a constitutional government will be established and American troops will come home when it is. And that will allow people for the first time to express themselves without having to kowtow to dictators and Islamicists. And that incident about Mr. Talbani was very important because lately 67% of the Iraqis said they did not want us to go home. And Mr. Talbani felt it was upon himself to assuage American public opinion and take it upon himself to say to us who are no longer supporting the war in a majority, you can leave in 2 years. And he was told by George Bush, not ordered, but told and said, you don't have to say that. We're going to stand beside you. So he went right back out and changed that. But not on the orders of Mr. Bush, who said, don't make that magnanimous gesture. We're here no matter what. And that's what was behind that. Sunnis. Well, Sunnis are 20% of the population. They have no oil. But they do have a history of supporting dictators and fascists like Saddam Hussein and Islamicists like Mr. Zakari. We are engaged in the most radical, idealistic effort in the history of this country. Whether you like it or not, we're putting people who are underprivileged and despised, the Kurds and the Shiite, who had no power. And anytime you take on a radical undertaking like that that's dangerous and necessary and humane, people will be upset. Just like the radical plantationists were upset during the Civil War. It was, Ariana suggested, you can't ever bring democracy on the heels of war. Ask the Japanese that, and ask the Italians that, and ask the Germans that, and ask the Argentines after the Falkland War. In fact, I wish it wasn't so. I wish it wasn't so in our case. But the fact of the matter is, throughout history, democracy often follows war. Why? Because war is evil? No. It's just morally neutral. It can be evil if it's waged to kill people and oppress people, but all of the great evils of our society, count them: chattel slavery, German Nazism, Japanese militarism, Italian fascism, Soviet totalitarianism. All of them were eliminated by force, or the threat of force. And as awful as the 20th century is, and it was the most awful for wars being conducted in our history of civilization, more people died in this century, outside the battlefield. And Hitler's Holocaust, the 50 million that Mao butchered with impunity, the 30 million Stalin killed off the battlefield, the 250,000 Milosevic killed, the people Pol Pot killed, all could have stopped if somebody had have stood up and said no. So war is awful, but there are things worse. Ask the dead in the concentration camps. Vietnam was raised by Ariana. That's a very good parallel. No, it's not a parallel to Iraq in one sense. We don't have nuclear sponsors on the borders curtailing our options. Right now, the Iraqi constitution is light years ahead of what happened in Vietnam. By 1974, most of the objectives of the United States were met. You had a viable country in the South that could evolve into something like South Korea. But for a variety of reasons, Watergate and the anti-war movement, we decided that we would not honor our obligations to protect through air power that government, and it was defeated by a North Vietnamese conventional invasion. And what followed when we decided to leave? That's not a good thing to bring up as wisdom that we should follow. 1 million boat people, 500,000 people executed, 500,000 in re-education camps, 30 years of totalitarian misery for the people of Vietnam. And what happened elsewhere once it saw the United States would not honor its commitments? Nicaragua, communist presence in Nicaragua, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Holocaust in Cambodia, the hostage-taking in Iran, all because the United States was seen that it either would not or could not stand up to its principles of supporting people who wanted to evolve into something different than totalitarianism. Katrina was raised. Well, that's interesting, because for all of the rhetoric about global warming, for all the rhetoric about a racial cauldron, for all the rhetoric about a non-carry of the United States, for all the rhetoric about too few troops, compare it with any other natural disaster. 15,000 people were killed in France just 3 years ago. Nobody responded to them. 200,000 people were killed in a tsunami because of they couldn't even monitor a tidal wave. The aid is still going to them. 40,000 were killed in Iran just 2 years ago. And for all the rhetoric that media said of 10,000 dead, 25,000 body bags, we are seeing the most generous, comprehensive effort in our history. And we will not see a natural disaster of the type that just happened everywhere in the world the last 3 years, precisely because we are a different and a much more compassionate country. Let me just finish by saying nobody wanted to go to Iraq before 9/11, and nobody likes to see Americans killed. But by any measure of history, this is something radically different in our history, at least in the Cold War period. We went to Iraq and the price of oil went up. We went to Iraq and the people who had never had a chance to vote are suddenly voting, the despised of that area. We went to Iraq and democratic fervor spread around the globe. How can you call it imperial and then at the same time criticize us for wasting American money on lives? If imperial empires do things that are in their interest, by any classical definition, this was in the interest for once in American history of allowing people of the Middle East to have a different chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Huffington, you have 15 minutes for rebuttal.
I know it must be really hard when all the facts are stacked against you to try to make a good argument for why being in Iraq is nothing more than an imperial adventure, tragically against the interests of the United States. And in fact, it must be so hard that Victor even accused me of mentioning and saying things I never said. This is recorded. You can hear that I never mentioned Vietnam. I'm sorry, I just didn't. I mean, I could have mentioned it. I can give you an hour speech on Vietnam and Iraq. I just didn't. So the fact that you felt you had to pull up that argument about this is not Vietnam, this is not the Vietnam quagmire, look what happened after Vietnam, the truth of the matter is that, of course, Iraq is not Vietnam in the same way, but it is Vietnam in the way that if the longer we stay there, the worse the situation becomes. Nobody is suggesting just moving out tomorrow. But the suggestion that staying there indefinitely until somehow the Iraqi forces are ready to take over the country, which could be Ahmed Shalabi's grandchildren, is in the best interest of the United States, is simply incomprehensible. Then Victor mentioned Katrina, and I must say the way you talked about Katrina is staggering. Because yes, there weren't 10,000 people dead, but there was a devastation that is unprecedented in this country. And to say that we responded well, absolutely we responded well as individuals, but nobody here is saying anything against the American people or America as a country. This is all against the American leadership of both political parties and the way that they are actually acting against our own interests. And we saw the same thing demonstrated in the Katrina aftermath. We saw what happens when there isn't the infrastructure and the responsiveness needed to deal with a disaster. And whether it's a natural disaster or a terrorist strike, the same factors prevail. And this is so unambiguous. And we also saw how our own security is very closely connected with the lives of millions of Americans who are poor and black predominantly, and who are not on the radar screen of this country. I mean, just read what the public editor wrote in the New York Times on Sunday, when he analyzed 10 years' worth of articles on New Orleans and how little mention was given to the state of poverty in New Orleans. And that is not just about the Bush administration, it's also about the Clinton administration, it's about the priorities of this country. And to mention that the people who died in Iraq are not predominantly African American is irrelevant. Are there any members of the ruling elite represented among those who died in Iraq? And that is the characteristic of an empire that I quoted you on NPR. And I must say your explanation about what you're saying on NPR is not really worthy of your brilliant mind, because you said that it's in black and white. I'm sorry, you said it before 9/11. I know you believe realities were changed after 9/11, but you categorically said that a characteristic of empire is when you have one class of people making the decisions and another class of people incurring the sacrifice. And this is so absolutely unequivocally what is going on in Iraq. The sacrifice is definitely not shared. It's not even shared among the majority of this country, because we're never called to do anything for this war. Unlike the Second World War, what have we been called to do beyond making tax cuts permanent? That's hardly the way you act at wartime if our own survival is at stake. Incidentally, I mentioned Shalabi and his grandchildren that may be the ones that will have to be in charge when the Iraqi forces are ready to take over the country. But why is Shalabi the oil minister and the deputy prime minister? Can anybody explain that to me? Remember, just to give you a refresher course, because I know that Victor is a Greek scholar, and there was a whole Greek myth about a river, Lethe. When people would drink from that river, they would get amnesia, and this seems to have happened here in this country when it comes to our leadership especially, but even among the people, because of the role of the media that I'll end with. But here we have the men who basically misguided the CIA and the leadership of this country on what kind of weapons Saddam had. Shalabi is now basically in charge of so much, and he's the one who's masterminded this constitution, it appears. He was quoted in the New York Times as basically saying, well, that's it, and the Sunnis can take it or leave it. And you cannot just dismiss the Sunnis as having all been Saddam loyalists. We're talking about 20% of the country. Democracies are about protecting the rights of the minorities. And they're also about protecting the rights of women, which are not exactly going to be protected in this constitution, which is going to be based on Islamic law. And ultimately, let me just say something about the media in this country, because we would not be where we are, and we would not have you, Victor, even try to defend the possibility of a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein, which you tried to do, to my absolute amazement, I have to say tonight. We would not have had that if the media were actually doing their job. But the media in this country have stopped doing their job a long time ago. I don't know what would have happened, but there is no question that the New York Times still has a huge responsibility for its role in the leading up to the war, with this absolutely disgusting reporting by Judy Miller on weapons of mass destruction, when she used sources that she never double-checked, when she used the administration sources to back up the Shalaby sources. And we had, if you go back and read the transcripts of the appearances of Dick Cheney and the rest of them on Meet the Press and other shows in the lead-up to the war, you would see how they would use the New York Times to buttress their arguments. They would say, well, you know, it's not me, Dick Cheney said, saying that Saddam has nuclear weapons or the opportunity and the ability to make nuclear weapons. It's the New York Times. The fact that it was his source that had given the information to the New York Times was, of course, not known because they're anonymous sources. So this is really the kind of behavior that exists when we stop operating as a republic. Because in a republic there is accountability, there is responsibility, there is putting the public interest first. And there is a sense of commonwealth. There isn't that sense of sacrifice that's not shared, the sense of a media that is basically kowtowing to power instead of speaking truth to power. And we now see that this is basically left to the people themselves. I now only have a couple more minutes left, so let me just say that to quote John Kerry and Hillary Clinton's speeches, as I made very clear in my speech, I'm not here to defend democratic leaders. I think they're just as responsible because in the absence of a loyal opposition, those with the wrong ideas can prevail. That's why we have a loyal opposition, supposedly, in this country, to oppose. And they failed to oppose. And they did it because of the most crass, calculating instincts. In 2002, you can just go and read Daschle and Gebhardt saying, let's just vote for the war, because then we can just put it aside and win in 2002 by concentrating on domestic issues. And guess what? They failed miserably in 2002. And in 2004, you had all sorts of foreign policy experts advising John Kerry to not put a lot of daylight between the president and himself on Iraq because he'll appear to be soft on terrorism, to just go ahead and just focus on domestic issues. But there is one truth in post-9/11 America, and this is that every election from now on is ultimately going to be about national security. Because the American people know that if we are not safe and we are not secure, nothing else matters as much. So ultimately, they are going to vote for the party that they believe is going to make them more secure. So the Democrats had better understand that. They cannot get away with primarily being a domestic policy party. They have to become the party that redefines national security so that it's not based on imperial adventures that have nothing to do with our self-interest, our safety, and the protection of those we love. And that's ultimately the major decision and the major dilemma that we are facing in this country. And it is very clear, it is without any doubt the greatest turning point and the greatest moral crisis in our country, and I say that with tremendous love for this country. As an immigrant, a naturalized American, I don't say it with any of the anti-American feelings that Victor kept quoting, the kind of straw man that we like to put up when our argument is weak. That's not what this is about. This is because I love America that I see the danger it is facing. And it's because I love America that I urge those who want to put the interests of America above the interests of any political party, Republican or Democrat, to stop remaining silent, to keep speaking out, because so much is at stake.
Thank you. We'll now have question time, and while questioners gather at the microphone, and Mandy, could you please show us where the microphone is? Okay, right there. The microphone is right there. Ms. Huffington, do you have a question for Dr. Hansen?
Sure. I have lots of questions for Dr. Hansen. One of my questions has to do with the famous flypaper theory. You've heard the president talk again and again about how we are fighting them over there so we don't fight them over here. Well, the London bombings, since after all Tony Blair was as much part of the war in Iraq as the president, the London bombings clearly demonstrate that this theory, if anybody really believed it, is preposterous. Do you agree?
Well, it proved just the opposite of what you're insinuating, because polls of Muslims in London, unlike our own Muslims in the United States, after the bombing said 30% of them approved of it. You wouldn't find that among the Muslim community in America, and what the London bombing showed is that London has failed to assimilate people along the American model. But I suppose if 50,000 people have been arrested or killed in Iraq, and they've come from different nations in large part, yeah, it has made us more secure. I suppose that the question is sort of, when you put decon trays out in your garage, I think that the rats come out and die, and you think they were invented out of thin air. And that's the difference, because they came from somewhere, and I don't believe somebody just suddenly at 10 o'clock in the morning got up and said, I want to kill America. So they had a predisposition. They went to Iraq, and they met the U.S. military, and they were defeated, and that's making us more secure. Because whatever we say, it's very unusual that after 9/11, people predicted an entire series of attacks. And what's happened? We've arrested over 500 terrorists here in the United States. We've radically changed the mentality of Americans who have no longer any tolerance for radical Islam and the madrasa hatred that's spewed. And we have taken out the Taliban and Saddam Hussein, and we're killing terrorists abroad. And yet, that's why we haven't been attacked. And Britain's got a lot to learn, and they're catching up.
Well, you know, I must respond to that, because not even the Secretary of Defense would agree with you. He said in one of his briefings, we still don't know whether we are creating more terrorists than we are killing. And that's really the heart of it. Because to say that all these people who are becoming terrorists always intended to be terrorists, instead of that they, in their absolutely irrational, fanatical way that nobody could ever justify, were provoked by the presence of the American military, the sense of occupation in the country, to actually rise against America. I mean, this is not a matter of opinion. There is no question that there weren't the kind of terrorists and the kind of fanatical Islamists in Iraq before we invaded that there are now. And equally as important is the fact that this is a war about hearts and minds and not just about weapons. And there is no question that the feeling towards America has dramatically changed since we invaded Iraq. And you see that all around the globe, and you see it particularly in the Islamic world, where the breeding ground for terrorists is.
Well, I explained in my opening statement that, in fact, that's wrong, that Osama bin Laden's popularity is going down. We're very popular with India, Japan. The Europeans who ran on anti-American platforms like Schroeder and Chirac are in deep political trouble, and people in Europe want closer ties than ever before, and we've seen radical changes. The Lebanese are happy to get the Syrians out. People are happy that Libya doesn't have nuclear weapons. People are happy that Pakistan has given up their nuclear arsenal. People are happy to have a chance that America's on the right side of history by pressuring Mr. Mubarak for elections. 67% of the Iraqis don't want us to leave. They want us to give them this chance. But I have a question for you, because you suggested that you had insight into what is wrong with this country in a way that the New York Times and I guess the American people don't. But while we should understand how this system works. This war was not dreamed up by some project for the new American century. We've had 2 national elections. That's what republics do. They're not empires. George Bush went to the people in 2002, and they had a national congressional election, and he gained seats, which is never heard of. And then he had a national presidential election where all these issues were aired, and we have a Senate that any time it wants to can cut off funds. It can be filibustered by an opposition. We have a Supreme Court and this matter has been adjudicated in the courts, and we have a free press. So you may think that this is an imperial anti-democratic war, but the people have so far expressed a different view. And when they change their mind, through most of the media is hostile, if they do change their mind, then we won't be in Iraq. But that's why we're a republic and not an empire.
Well, I don't know why you're quoting meaningless Iraqi polls, given the state of the country, and you're not quoting American polls. You say the people are not against the war. Over 60% in every poll taken are against the war. And as for why George Bush got elected, absolutely. I blame John Kerry and the Democrats for his election. I blame the fact that John Kerry could not speak one straight sentence on Iraq. I was going like that. And I wanted him to win. I understand why people created a group called John Kerry Haters for John Kerry. Because people wanted him so much to win because they wanted Bush out, but they could not understand. I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it. That amazing Grand Canyon statement which buried his campaign when he said that even if I knew what I know now, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, I would still have voted for the war in Iraq. That was the end of it. Of course the American people did not vote for him because they'd rather vote for somebody who sounds like he knows what he's talking about even when he doesn't, than for somebody who consistently sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about on the key issue of our time. And I said it and I'll say it again, every election will be decided on national security and Democrats had better get their act together.
These elections, suddenly 52% said they weren't against it. And if things happen, and I'm confident that this Constitution goes through, if Saddam's put on trial, if we have more further developments, the Americans' losses, then they'll be back. But you don't run a foreign policy in 3-week polls. You just don't. If you look at the American people on December 5th, none of them wanted to get involved to save England. And after December 7th, almost everybody did. That's what polls do. They reflect the pulse of the battlefield. But what statesmen do is they look at the long-term interest of their country and the world at large, and they make decisions on reason, not on what popularity at any given moment as it's deciphered through a popular media. This is very hostile from the very beginning to this war.
Well, I must respond to that because I actually have co-founded the Partnership for a Poll-Free America, so there are very few people in this country who dislike leadership by polls more than I do, and that's not what I was saying. What I was saying is that there has been a crisis of leadership in this country, and I made that very clear about the lack of clear leadership on this issue among the Democrats. And what I'm saying is that the fact that now majority opinion is changing is unequivocal. It's not just a matter of polls, it's anecdotal, it's everywhere. And it's a factor of why right now you're beginning to see the American people making up their own minds and not just listening to their leaders. They're looking at the facts. They're looking at our own safety, our own security, and our own interests. And that's why, once again, the American people, I believe, will lead and our leaders will follow, as has happened at many great moments of protest in this country.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point we should take questions from our audience. Please state your name and ask your question as briefly as possible so that as many people as possible can participate.
Yeah, my name is Stephen, Dr. Hansen. I'm enjoying this, number one, and I kind of disagree with what you said about categorizing the deaths and the question. Okay. During the 2000 election, Mr. Bush said that he did not believe and would not endeavor in nation building. Can you tell me the difference between imperialism and nation building? Is there a difference in that?
Yeah, an imperial power would have gone to Iraq, taken out Saddam Hussein, installed 500,000 troops, and got its hands on 1/5 of the world's oil. A Republican country like our own would spend $300 billion of its own money, sacrifice treasure for a democratic experiment, and see oil go from $30 to $70 a barrel.
I misspoke myself. I meant an empire. I meant an empire because, as you are well aware, Mr. Bush was selected 5-4 in our democratic society, and the difference between an empire and nation building. I misspoke.
I just
myself.
answered. An empire would have done what I just said, and a other country wouldn't. We're nation building. That's what people do when they sacrifice treasure, like we did after World War II in Japan, in Germany, and Italy. Americans are at great cost to this country are trying to give people in the Middle East a chance to break this pernicious cycle between a non-choice between Islamic theocracy and dictatorship. So brave Americans went over there, bravest people this civilization's ever produced. And they're fighting, and they know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for a chance for people to be free and to stop this cycle of terror. And they don't want oil because the price has gone up. And they don't want Iraq. They want to come home as soon as possible. That's called nation building. It's not what the Soviet Empire did.
Thank you.
Well, if our goal, let me just respond to that, because if our goal had been from the beginning to bring democracy and freedom to Iraq, why didn't we say that to the American people before we invaded Iraq?
We did.
Oh,
we did.
no, come on.
Whatever you want
Let's
to think
go-
about
let's
Iraq,
go
nobody
read-
thought that when Saddam went away that we were going to put an American dictatorship or the Shah or somebody like that. That was the criticism. What I can't figure it out from the left is that, first of all, they criticize us for going into Iraq and being imperial, and then they criticize us for being naively idealistic that you can bring democracy to such a people. Well, that's what you said. How can you bring democracy to people without a history? That's idealism. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say we're cynical realpolitik or we're naive buffoons who want to do something that can't be done.
I'll
It's got
tell
to be
you
one
what
or the
I'm
other.
saying. What I'm saying is that we're being both hubristic and incompetent. And that is really a lethal combination. And we're seeing it again and again. And the truth of the matter is that, as Paul Wolfowitz said unequivocally, they picked the WMD explanation because it was the easiest to sell to the American people. And bringing democracy to Iraq was the fourth explanation as to why we are in Iraq. And the American people are beginning to see that. Remember also, we were told by Paul Wolfowitz that the supplies of oil in Iraq were going to pay for this war. Do you remember that? So the fact that they haven't is just another proof of incompetence. It's not a fact that we're not an imperial power just because we're an incompetent imperial power.
My question is for Adriana. Tom Hausman, I come from a military family. My son's classmate was the first person of his class to be killed in action, and his ring had to be reproduced because he died in the World Trade Center. My question is this to you. We have a local person by the name of Eric Prince, who is the head of Blackwater. I think one of the things that is very disturbing is the involvement of mercenaries, including foreign nationals, in the war in Iraq, and now, surprisingly, alarmingly, also in New Orleans. These mercenaries have been acting basically in terms of the protection of corporate interest. Would you tell me, do you find the use of mercenaries, both in Iraq and in New Orleans, as acceptable?
Well, you're actually bringing up one of the major problems we're facing at the moment, which is the fact that recruitment numbers are down for the first time in 5 years. The fact that basically we don't have the army we need to finish the job in Iraq. We didn't have the National Guard we needed to do the job right in New Orleans. And so we are forced to use mercenaries who are being paid an enormous amount of money. I was talking to Congressman Ed Markey recently, who has all the numbers about how much mercenaries are being paid in Iraq. At the same time, some of our best officers are not re-enlisting. At the same time, the National Guard is being depleted, and people are not enlisting in the National Guard at the same numbers that that were being enlisted before. And if this dream of bringing democracy to the Middle East is going to continue at our expense, we just don't have the ability to do it. I mean, even if they wanted to invade Syria or Iran or any other country at the moment. We just simply do not even have the resources to do the job here in New Orleans when it comes to the military and the National Guard. And that is really the tragedy, that we have actually decimated the best military in the world because of this disastrous world.
Thank you very much. And in terms of the mercenaries, aren't mercenaries a trademark of imperialism?
Well, it's another trademark of imperialism, absolutely.
Next question, please.
Just reply to that. The use of mercenaries started in the Clinton administration because 1/3 of the conventional and strategic Air Forces, Marines, and Navy were cut. I think it's a very disastrous decision to do that, but it was a long-standing part of American policy that to cut the military, then you had to outsource jobs, and that's what we've done. And it's part of the idea of putting as few troops as possible into Iraq simply because of the Vietnam syndrome, that by 1965 we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and the American phone book in Saigon weighed 11 pounds. So people thought, we don't want to have a big footprint this time. So whatever we're going to do, remember there's going to be a particular criticism. Too few troops, we're understaffed, you put too many, we have too big of a footprint. I think it's a dangerous precedent, but it did not start in this war. It started in the early 90s when the decision was made by Clinton and a Democratic and Republican Congress to cut the military drastically at the end of the Cold War. And it was a strategic mistake.
But, you know, Victor, I really suggest that you stop looking at the world in right, left, and Democrat, Republican terms if you want to understand what's happening and if you really to understand what those of us who believe this is an imperial adventure are saying. Because every time somebody makes an argument which is incredibly valid, you counter by saying, well, Democrats did it. So what? We are not here to defend Democrats. We're not here to defend any particular group. We are here to defend what we believe is right for the United States of America. And if you stop looking at the world through this obsolete prism of right, left, Democrats, Republicans, you'll never be able to face the facts as they are on the ground, and you'll keep repeating the same cliches about what Democrats are supposed to want and what Republicans are supposed to want, when I made it very clear, at least I tried to in my speech, that some of the most vocal, interesting and powerful voices against our imperial adventure in Iraq are Republicans like Chuck Hagel, like Walter Jones, like Bill Buckley, like Pat Buchanan, hardly the kind of people you would identify with the isolationist left.
Let me just make a statement. I tried to refrain from ad hominem attacks. This is not, I'm not on crossfire. I'm not just somebody you just have these cliches. Well, you didn't listen. It's very important to listen. Let me finish. I just said that the use of contractors, I agreed, was pernicious, and that it took place in the Clinton administration and it took place in the Bush administration, and a Republican and a Democratic Congress approved of it and approved of the cuts. So don't suggest that I'm picking on the Democrats. I just made a statement. You could hear it. Anybody could. So it's easy to say that your opponent is partisan. You've said that now 500 times, but you haven't listened to what I said.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
My name is Tom Apple, and this is for Dr. Hansen. I truly appreciate your history lesson. I wonder, though, are you at least a little bit bothered by the fact that we were lied into a war?
That we were lied into a war? I think the administration made and I wrote at the time, made a strategic mistake because they had a resolution by Congress that outlined 23 counts, and it was bipartisan on both sides. There was a consensus. And they decided, I think, to privilege the one consensus that was not the most important, WMD. There were all sorts of grounds. They had violated the 91 Accords. That war had cost us 350,000 sorties. Any day that an American plane did not fly, the Kurds were going to be attacked, and they'd suffered from genocide. The man had tried to kill a U.S. president. He'd attacked for it. There were plenty of reasons, and I think the reason they did it was a mistake. But I will say this, that if you go back and read the literature at the time when the Senate voted for those 23 counts, the criticism of the Bush administration and the bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle was that they were using a shotgun approach. They were throwing anything they could to go to Iraq and see what could stick. So again, we have this problem in America that whatever we do, people criticize. If we concentrate on one, then it's a false one and the war was cooked up. Bush lied, thousands died. If we go to the real truth, the 23 counts that bipartisan people of all political persuasions approved of, then suddenly we're throwing everything but the kitchen sink. You can't win.
Well, you can't win when you don't have the facts on your side, and that's the problem right now. And that's why, here I'm sorry, Victor, but you're not hearing what I'm saying. I did not accuse you of being partisan. On the contrary. What I said is that the fact that Democrats also did something wrong or said something wrong doesn't make it right. That's exactly the point I'm making. And in the same way here, to say that they privileged the one consensus that the American public would agree with, that's just the language you used, does not get away from the fact that they chose the presence of WMD because, as Paul Wolfowitz said, it was the easiest way to sell the war. They basically manipulated the American public, and they were successful at manipulating the American public. But now the facts are so horrendous and so impossible to spin away that the American public is waking up and speaking out. And that's really the dramatic shift that has happened.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Hello, I'm Glenn Freeman. I'm going to shift the focus away from Iraq here. The focus on the debate has been military imperialism. What about corporate imperialism? What do you, this is a question for both of you. How would you differentiate the relationship between two countries, Cuba and China, with the United States of America?
Well, I think everybody's worried about corporations. I'm speaking as somebody who saw everybody in my neighborhood in Central California, and my brother and cousin who declared bankruptcy as small farmers because they could not compete with corporate agribusiness. So it's everybody's concerned about it. But by the same token, corporations are morally neutral. They just represent a system of delivering goods and services quicker to us. In my dressing room, there was grapes. Grapes are not grown here in Michigan. I can't get them to you from my farm. The corporate structure does that. Everything that we see in this hallway, from the lights to the SUVs to the gasoline, is a product of a system. And it's incumbent upon us to watch it all the time and to insist that we don't have a Kofi Annan oil for food or a Kinley. But that's in the hearts of man. The system is just there, and it's incumbent upon us to watch about it. As far as Cuba or China goes, I think it's pretty clear that here's the United States right next to Cuba, and it has a per capita income of about 10 times the size, about 25 times the rate of Cuba, and the Chinese have seen this, and they have abandoned Mao's failed dream that gave them poverty and 50 million of their own citizens butchered, and they followed the American model. It's clear.
Well, they haven't exactly followed the American model. They're still butchering their own people. And we should not forget that as we are opening trade routes with China and bringing them into the WTO. Let's not forget that they are continuing to kill people for their religious beliefs.
Well, I'm talking about the economic model, not the political.
Yeah, but an economic model is not separate from a moral model on which a country is based. And for you to say that corporations are morally neutral is to really ignore what's happening, say, with Walmart, a morally neutral corporation that is being sued in multiple states for sexual harassment of women, that locks up employees at night, that refuses to pay health care costs, and on and on and on. And the fact that we have a system that allows that kind of behavior and tolerates it is an indictment on our own political system. And the fact that campaign contributions, unfortunately, and lobbyists in this country are allowing corporations that, whether you talk of Walmart domestically or Halliburton in Iraq, there is nothing morally neutral about overcharging the American military for meals that you did not deliver to the American military in Iraq, as happened with Halliburton. I don't know about you, but I would like to have a 3 strikes and you're out rule when it comes to corporate behavior, but we don't. We don't, at least when it comes to government contracts, that we should not allow government contracts, taxpayer-funded contracts, to go to corporations that are not behaving in a moral way consistent with the principles of this country.
I think you just reiterated what I said, because the jet that got you here and the hotel you'll stay tonight are corporate chains, and you will enjoy them, and you'll hope that people monitor them so they give you that same honest service. And when they don't, we criticize them. But just to, as a boutique criticism, say, I don't like corporations, they're greedy, they're at the trough, then it would be incumbent on you to have nothing to do with them. But they're a system, and they require us to be scrutinized. But inherently, they do a lot of good, and they got us here tonight, and they'll get us home.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, we must conclude. Please join me in thanking two very informed, insightful debaters.